Welcome back. Today I'm going to be reviewing House of the Dragon. I've been watching this show since it began. I started on Game of Thrones when season 8 was coming out. I watched all of it in 2018, became a massive fan, got really hooked, watched season 8 when it came out, and was very excited to watch this show back when its first season was coming out, all the way back in 2022. Since I've never made a House of the Dragon review before, I'm going to lay out my thoughts on the first 2 seasons very briefly, things that I like, things that I'm less keen on, and then I'm going to talk about the 3 episodes we've seen from season 3 so far, and I intend to make videos on each episode as it comes out. I haven't decided if I'm going to do a video for 2 episodes, 3 episodes, or 1 each, but I will be going through the entirety of the 3rd season, so make sure you like and subscribe to make sure you don't miss any of that, and check out a couple of my other film and TV reviews. So if I try and remember how I felt 4 years ago when this show was finally coming out, I was quite concerned, because everyone knows that the 8th and final season of Game of Thrones was a bit disappointing, and by a bit, I mean incredibly disappointing. If I wasn't already a Doctor Who fan, I would have said it was the most disappointing thing I've ever seen. But unfortunately, I've been down this road before. But it has to be said, the scale of the season 8 failure is really profound because of how much hype and how beloved Game of Thrones going into season 8 really was. And it was astonishing how quickly the hype faded and the reputation of the show fell into one of being a show you wouldn't recommend watching. People aren't interested in checking it out anymore, getting immersed in the world, even though nothing has changed about the previous seasons that got everyone so hooked. Season 4 of Game of Thrones is still really great, even though season 8 is terrible. So a lot was riding on House of the Dragon to revitalize the brand's image. This was the first spin-off that was being made. We hadn't had anything else yet, and the fact that David and Dan were not involved in this show didn't really tell us anything, because it could still be with a whole new team of writers falling into exactly the same problems that befell the later seasons of Game of Thrones. And actually, for all of David and Dan's faults, I think they were actually very adept at adapting the source material from George R.R. Martin. And since House of the Dragon was going to be another adaptation, would these writers be able to have the adaptation skills that the previous writers did? And thankfully, season 1 of House of the Dragon is brilliant. The best thing by a long way in this first season is the acting. All of the actors do a great job. Millie Alcock, Emily Carey, Eve Best, Ewan Mitchell, Matt Smith, Emma Darcy, Rhys Ifans, Matthew Needham, Steve Toussaint, Tom Glyn Carney, the list just goes on. But the absolute best actor in this show, the one who absolutely stole it and made the first season incredible, more so than any other, is Paddy Considine. Like, everyone else is great, and the action in the show is great, and there's a lot of things that grip me, but my emotional investment really was attached to Viserys, and Paddy Considine's performance of Viserys, how human he makes him, how pathetic he really feels. And I think pathetic is the right word. I don't mean it in a contemptuous way of him, even though he does make decisions that are really bad, and you can foresee how they're only short-term solutions that he can't uphold, that he doesn't do any additional work to try and make sure his promises to Rhaenyra are followed through on. But on the other hand, you feel incredibly sorry for Viserys because he loses so much in the show, and he suffers because of his health, and whilst he isn't doing enough for Rhaenyra often, or any of his children, including his children by Alicent, he also physically is unable in many ways to perform those duties. In fact, the 3rd episode that I just watched put it very well, which was that Viserys lived in a world of his own making. And it was just so engaging to watch this man who had one single goal, which was for his family to get along with one another, show each other love and affection. And whilst that is all he really wanted, his actions are what have caused this entire civil war to unfold. And if Viserys was truly honest with the people around him and was able to foresee things he really should have been able to foresee, this entire war could have been avoided. But I never feel very annoyed with him, even though I probably should, because the probable reason he has failed at this is motivated out of his own suffering and fear of losing the people near him. And that is such a difficult struggle for Viserys that it really attached me to his emotions. And there are so many incredible moments in episode 1 and episode 8 in particular. Watching Viserys struggle towards the Iron Throne to defend Rhaenyra's legitimacy is one of the best moments in this show for me. The other is when he's at the table with his family and he takes his mask off and looks at them. The way his voice breaks in his delivery of that monologue is so heartbreaking. And knowing that, spoilers, he dies in that very episode makes that scene so much more impactful on a rewatch. So I love Viserys, and it's because of him that I care about the other characters in this story. Sure, they're relatable in their own way, but he was the emotional core of the first season, and it really reinstilled confidence in me that future stories we can tell in this Game of Thrones world, in Westeros, could be just as impactful as they were in the original show. I'm not going to list all the great things about the first season and the show in general because the list is really long. It's great to see more dragons, it's good to see some of the sets that they've built for this place. I like the reinterpretation of the Iron Throne earlier in its life. In the books, the throne is described as being enormous and forged of hundreds of swords, whereas in Game of Thrones it looks like kind of a small chair, so I like that it's broadened out to be consistent with the show, but in House of the Dragon there are these swords lining the walkway towards the throne. Little things like that I enjoy as well. There were some elements, however, that concerned me, such as the hard linking of this show to the Game of Thrones show. And the main way that this was done in the first season was with the Song of Ice and Fire that Viserys tells Rhaenyra. He basically tells her that the Night King is coming and we need Daenerys Targaryen to be able to save the day, and therefore Rhaenyra must know this to be able to govern like a just and proper ruler with the ability to forward plan and have perspective, and why it's important that the right Targaryen must be on the throne. But my first reaction when I heard this story being told was, why are we doing this? This is a good show. This first season is a great piece of media in and of itself and does not need linking to Game of Thrones. And all you do when you link to Game of Thrones, not just that show, but in particular elements of season 8 and how that show ends, means that you're kind of relying on the payoff of that show, which we know is bad, to build up into the payoff of this show too. And that just seems a bit unnecessary to me. People don't want to be reminded of how that season ended. If they're here for House of the Dragon, the chances are they enjoyed the earlier seasons and would quite like to forget that 8th one. I'm sure there are some people that like that it links and actually maybe enjoy season 8, but on the whole, I know that is not the general consensus. They did this again in the second season when Daemon had a vision of Daenerys specifically hatching her dragons at the end of the first season of Game of Thrones, and they're doubling down on linking Game of Thrones to this show, and I can understand why, but I don't think it's necessary. Build your own show that someone could just watch and never have seen Game of Thrones and still be able to think it's a classic in its own right. That is a bit of a problem that this show has throughout all of its seasons, but we'll get into that more in a bit. But one big difference between this show and Game of Thrones is how the characters speak. Now, I personally like how the characters talk in this show, but I understand that the reason for that is because I'm a weirdo. I think one of the reasons Game of Thrones appealed was because the characters talked to each other in such plain terms. In this show, the speaking is a lot more formal, and words are often in an old-fashioned order. They don't roll off the tongue in the way that you and I would speak. And I think that can be alienating because I watch the show with subtitles. I watch all shows with subtitles, so I never miss what they're saying. But I know full well that I would miss details if I wasn't watching with subtitles, and that isn't really a good thing for a show to be doing to its audience. It should be easy to follow. I don't think it should be second screen level TikTok content like much of the output on Netflix, but it doesn't have to be difficult to follow when listening to the characters speak in order to present a show that is challenging to the audience and requires them to engage their brain. There were also some plot points that I wasn't a fan of. The main one was Kristen Cole killing Joffrey in the 5th episode in front of everyone in an extremely violent way at the end of the 5th episode, and then by the 6th episode, he's the sworn sword of Alicent, with no explanation as to what exactly happened, some allusion perhaps to a deal that they made, some agreement they came to, but really, everyone saw Kristen Cole do that. How would Alicent talk them out of Kristen not being executed for killing that person, seemingly for no reason? Stuff like that doesn't make sense. But overall, season 1 had a really great mix of emotional drama. I was super invested, especially episodes 4, 7, and 8, in the relationships between the characters. Rhaenyra and Alicent's relationship is really interesting. Viserys was brilliant. Daemon was a very interesting character. I was also quite interested in Rhaenys's and Corlys's relationship with each other and how they have different opinions in their marriage and how they act differently with Rhaenyra and Viserys. There was also great action, like the battle against the crab feeder, and some dragon flying sequences, like when Aemond claims Vhagar, and the sequence where the children are fighting and Aemond loses an eye, and then Rhaenyra and Alicent are fighting it out between them, and Alicent's trying to claim another child's eye. That stuff was great. So there's loads of iconic and great moments from the first season of House of the Dragon. In season 2, I feel like there was less of those moments, and this was a step down in quality for the show. It only had 8 episodes, and it didn't really have an epic finale in terms of spectacle the way that Game of Thrones seasons had before. Even in the first season, it ends with Lucerys being eaten by Vhagar, which, whilst not a battle, is obviously a really significant moment in the war between Rhaenyra and Alicent. And season 1 leaves you feeling like we've built up to this conflict, and the second season is going to be where it kicks off. And it turns out it isn't really. It starts off strong, but then season 2 leaves you with the same feeling, like pieces are still moving into place, characters are still setting the plot into motion. We haven't actually had the battle. It's unclear when this war has started and where its end might be. And I get that that's kind of how it happens in real life, like you just sort of end up in a war without there being a clear "this is the I declare war" moment. And really there are loads of those that you could point to in the show as being that particular moment between the blacks and the greens. Whatever the reasons were for the reduced episode count, be that the writers' strike or anything else, the first 2 seasons of the 3rd season do seem like they would have fit as a 2-part finale to this 2nd season. But having said that, season 2 did still have its share of great moments. The Battle of Rook's Rest in episode 4 was really well done, which is the battle between Meleys, Sunfire, and Vhagar, and that battle is the standout for the season for me. The standout moment emotionally and in terms of visuals. I did genuinely enjoy the first episode with Blood and Cheese killing Jaehaerys, but I do understand how if you know what happens in the original source material, then this show can be a bit disappointing in that regard. In Fire and Blood, instead of asking Helaena which one of the 2 is Jaehaerys so they can kill him, Blood and Cheese instead force Helaena to pick Jaehaerys or Maelor, or they will kill both of them. Helaena, for whatever reason, picks Maelor, and then Blood and Cheese tell him that his mother wants him dead, and they take off Jaehaerys' head instead. That is a lot more impactful than what we got in the show, because Blood and Cheese are really evil there, and in the show Blood and Cheese are a lot more sympathetic, and the biggest clue that we're given that they're actually mean guys, other than the fact they're killing a child, is that one of them kicks that dog really hard. There are a couple of things here about the show overall. One would be that comparison is the thief of joy. What we got in the show is still 2 people beheading a child, which is not the kind of thing that most people are comfortable with. It is a dark moment, it is horrifying, but what some book readers may feel is that the show is cheating them out of an emotional moment. A lot of people who'd read that were expecting that moment to be worse than it was, and therefore were disappointed when they didn't feel the kind of emotion they were expecting to feel, because the writers changed the events from the source material material. And like I said, personally, I haven't got a problem with it because they did still behead a child, which is pretty dark for me. But the second thing is to do with the idea of the unreliable narrator. Fire and Blood is the source material, but it is written from the perspective of a maester. And George R. R. Martin deliberately introduces multiple perspectives, such as Mushroom, who is a jester dwarf, if I remember rightly, to try and get across the point that history is not clear-cut. There are different interpretations based on different perspectives of each character. And as a result, the writers, when adapting this, have a different job to what David and Dan had when they adapted A Song of Ice and Fire. Dave and Dan were basically adapting plot events from the book. And actually, in A Song of Ice and Fire, they cut tons, to the point where Game of Thrones is an entirely different story to A Song of Ice and Fire. First of all, it doesn't seem like it's going to end in the same way, certainly not in terms of pacing, if A Song of Ice and Fire ends at all, which is a big if at this point. There are tons of characters who are cut out, not involved, replaced with others, and therefore reading the books is almost like an entirely different experience. What the writers of House of the Dragon have to do is take subjective third-party accounts and construct the plot events of what really happened, and then build an emotional storyline that connects all of these characters and propels the plot forwards. Whereas in a Game of Thrones, you have first-hand accounts, not third-hand accounts. You can piece together the plot events easily, and then you've just got to engineer who you feel sorry for, what are the motivations of each character, where is it going to go next. And that is a simpler job, scene by scene, than it is for Fire and Blood. I would say the challenge for adapting A Song of Ice and Fire comes in the scale of the story, which David and Dan compensated for by cutting loads of it out. In House of the Dragon, I feel like we cut loads of the story out, but then we also make changes that we are within our rights to do, but I don't think actually serve the story. For example, is it really important that Laris Strong has a foot fetish? In the books, Kristen Cole throws Lord Beesbury out of a window, or at least that's the account. In the show, they decide to get Kristen Cole to sit Beesbury down in his chair so hard that his head hits the ball, which is used to clock in and out of their small council meetings, and the ball impales his skull, killing him immediately. I don't know why that change is better than what we had in the source material, which was to throw Beesbury out of the window. I don't really know why it's better to change Blood and Cheese to be more sympathetic when at the end of the day they are murdering a child and they're doing it for money. I don't think it's important to show that these people can be confused or scared. It's not important, and actually I'm not that in favor of the change, even though the change doesn't bother me that much, if that makes sense. I don't know why it's important to have Aemond kiss Alicent. I don't know why it's important for Rhaenyra and the White Worm to kiss. There are a lot of these kind of changes, and I'm only naming a few. Another interesting thing to do with the unreliable narrator is that the Rogue Prince is the nickname used for Daemon Targaryen, and it's supposed to refer to the fact that Daemon, to some people, was viewed as a hero and a great man, and to others was an evil person. And to be honest, the show doesn't really show two sides of Daemon. Daemon is brave and he is courageous, certainly in battle, but Daemon isn't really a good person. I mean, when does he really do anything that's in service of others other than Rhaenyra? And that's only after he got shown the Alice Rivers vision to season 1 of Game of Thrones. I understand that adapting this is difficult, and I know that George R. R. Martin has actually ditched his involvement in the show because they're not sticking to the source material so closely. And I'm sympathetic to the challenge of adapting this. To be honest, I would like to think of this show as entirely separate from Fire and Blood and the Rogue Prince, in the same way that I think of Game of Thrones as separate to A Song of Ice and Fire. But it is increasingly difficult to do that when so much of the story feels cut out, and there are changes made from the source material that don't serve the story and actually just diminish it, with seemingly no good justification for the change in the first place, other than to simply make it different. All of the toing and froing where Rhaenyra goes to King's Landing, or Alicent goes to Dragonstone and no one notices, even though there's a blockade. None of that made any sense to me. It was a change from the source material and just took me out of the show. The second season was such a downgrade in quality that it's taken me quite a long time to actually get back into watching the third season of this show. As I'm recording this, the third episode has already come out and the fourth one comes out very soon. But my interest in watching it from the first episode, like I did with the second season, was not here for the third because of that second season. I also haven't even watched Night of the Seven Kingdoms, which I've heard is good and entertaining. And I probably will watch it soon because I'm back into watching these kind of shows, but it really was a letdown in some ways, and it is interesting to see how it affected my interest in the show. And I think it comes down to the problem that the show hasn't really worked out what scenes it's going to be doing in the future, other than the big ones, and therefore doesn't know how to plan itself going into the future. Why are you showing me Kristen Cole killing Lord Beesbury? The surface level answer is you're showing me because that's what happens in the story. Kristen Cole kills him. That's the next thing to happen. But that's not really the reason you're showing me that, because you can cut that out. That's not important. It doesn't tell me anything about Kristen Cole's character. It is not purposeful in that season. You're showing me Beesbury being killed because presumably you are going to lead into what happens in the third season at the Battle of the Honeywine, which would be where the Beesburys side with the Blacks because of what happened to Lyman Beesbury in the first season, where Kristen Cole, who was the sworn sword of a green, killed him. That's the important thing. Because of the actions of Kristen Cole in that moment, the Blacks had an advantage in beating the Greens in that particular battle because they sided with the Blacks instead of the Greens. Yet, in season 3, that is not shown. For some reason, the writers decided to just cut a bunch of the battles that happen between the Blacks and the Greens, and it just makes me feel really confused because now that scene of Lyman being killed has very little impact. It doesn't tell me anything about the characters, it doesn't impact the story, it has no effect on the future plot, when it really should. And this is what early Game of Thrones did very well, because they were able to forward plan up to a certain point. Early Game of Thrones was able to set up events that were going to happen in 2, 3, 4 seasons time, and the show kind of fell apart when it wasn't able to do that anymore. With House of the Dragon, there really is no excuse why you shouldn't be able to pay off perfectly all of the events, because the entire story is written. But the problem is, because they haven't adapted all of it yet, they don't know what's going to happen in season 4 or season 5 or whenever this show happens to end, which at this rate is going to be a long time if they keep doing 8 episode seasons. So the second season had some great moments. It had Blood and Cheese, it had the funeral of Jaehaerys, it had Rook's Rest, it had the claiming of the dragons by the illegitimate sons. Another thing I really like about the show is the way that it explores the development of the green children. Each of them have something different going on with them that is a problem in some way. Jaehaerys and Lucerys seem kind of well adjusted. I mean, as well adjusted as you can be, being a royal living in King's Landing in Westeros, but they don't seem to have many developmental issues in terms of their socialization, whereas Aegon is almost effectively like a sociopath. He doesn't have any care for other people. He commits a range of crimes, certainly against women in the show, and he has very low self-esteem. He feels thrust into a situation of being the eldest son and the heir to the Iron Throne without really wanting it, or without there ever being consideration made as to what he might actually want to do with his life. He's never considered it. He'd like to be given the chance, but he doesn't even know because he's never thought about it. He's never had the bandwidth. He's just been prepared for being the king his entire life. He doesn't have a relationship with his father. His father is absent. He never shows him love. He doesn't have a great relationship with his mother either, because his mother has told him his entire life that he is a target, and if he's not strong enough, if he's not clever enough, then he will be killed. Aemond is a lot more suited for ruling in some ways because he is a better warrior and probably more intelligent than Aegon, but he's the second son, so he is denied and he always feels inferior. He has this constant need to prove himself. He never wants to be seen as weak, especially after losing his eye in a confrontation with Lucerys when he was very young. strong. He never wants to be in a position where someone can take something from him and damage him and humiliate him physically and visibly ever again. Aemond's character starts as a child who was never able to ride a dragon. He was the only one who did not have a dragon. He was bullied by his older brother, and Aemond ended up being, even with his poor depth perception, which always makes me laugh, the fact that he can be a great swordsman with only one eye and the ability to perceive depth. But anyway, he becomes a great swordsman and he gets the biggest dragon in the land, certainly that we know of at this time. So whilst he may seem like he is suited to rule, he is actually incredibly insecure, and that makes him unstable and dangerous. And ultimately, probably like Aegon, he would be a selfish ruler, which would not serve the interests of the realm. And Helena wants very little to do with the politics. Again, her agency has been stripped from her largely to try and secure the legitimacy of Aegon's children and therefore Aegon's claim to the Iron Throne as Viserys' oldest son. She has been married to her brother Aegon by Alicent. She doesn't really have much of a relationship with her mum at the start, but she does learn to forgive her mother, which is very interesting. She seems the most capable of compassion, but that is because she has such little self-interest. She is not interested in ruling. She instead has these visions, these premonitions of things that are to come, which probably gives her more of a perspective. So the second season had good moments, but it also had moments that dragged, such as Daemon being in Harrenhal. That seemingly went on for ages, and Harrenhal was a really boring location. The dream sequences weren't that engaging. The set looked quite dark and dingy and boring. It didn't really have the eerie quality I expected. Did anyone really get the sense that Harrenhal was haunted and that spirits lived in the walls? I certainly didn't. And with no climactic ending, the season kind of felt like a letdown. And so now we're in the third season, and as I record this, we've had 3 episodes out. The 4th is to come out soon. Now, the first episode of the third season is really great. Excellent battle sequences. You know, I obviously like the dragon parts, where Jacaerys and Baela fly in on Vermax and Moondancer and light up the ships is a really great visual. And Sheepstealer coming in. So Rhaena has no control over Sheepstealer. She is able to guide Sheepstealer towards the fight at the beginning, but then she's not able to draw him away. I do quite like the chaos of him being involved, but we haven't quite had the payoff of that moment yet, which would come from the fact that she thinks she's responsible for Jacaerys' subsequent death. Baela obviously knows that Rhaena was the person on Sheepstealer and therefore is the one responsible, but she hasn't divulged that information yet. Rhaenyra and Daemon still don't know who the rider of Sheepstealer is, so all of these things are still to be paid off, and I hope that the remainder of the season, or in the future season, this is done properly, done justice, because it really needs to be. I do like the idea that the show is introduced of dragons being a power that people cannot really control. You can tame them, you can temper them, but you can never fully control them. This was one of the interesting things about Game of Thrones. Daenerys has great control over all of her dragons, which I guess you could kind of expect because she grew up with them. But when you had a traditional fight like Spoils of War, as soon as a dragon comes in, the armies are destroyed, the weaponry has basically no impact. A dragon is like a nuclear arsenal, and it can just wipe out the entire army really easily, really quickly, and really brutally. So the question when you have loads of dragons in a story is, how do you make it still a high stakes battle involving conventional armies when dragons are involved? And the only things you can really do are have both sides have dragons, so they're focused on each other and not just destroying an army, or you have the army be prepared with scorpions or other artillery and weapons that they can use to take out dragons from the ground without the need of a dragon themselves. And the third way is by having the riders not being able to fully control the actions of the dragons. Having the dragons become potentially rogue operators in the battlefield adds a level of danger and unpredictability to each battle sequence, which I really like. It's actually my favorite thing, I think, about the action in House of the Dragon. But my favorite thing about this battle is not really the dragon stuff. It's actually the Corlys Velaryon stuff. I really like seeing Corlys being able to command the ship, use his knowledge and military strategy to be able to navigate his large ship through a dangerous gullet, luring people who are pursuing pursuing him into a trap. He's tactical, and that whole sequence where the boats crash into each other and there's the hand-to-hand combat is really great. I love seeing Corlys in his element because we haven't really seen that so far, and I love seeing Alan as well in his element. He has a lot of similarities to Corlys in that way and does seem to be his natural heir, if only he was to be legitimized, which is something very interestingly explored in the third episode when Corlys asks for Adam and Alan to be legitimized as Velaryons. Now, this is a little bit of a self-serving gesture. In fact, it's a very self-serving gesture. It is not done really at all for the sake of Adam or for Alan. Maybe it is a little bit. Maybe Corlys genuinely does feel a little bit sorry, and maybe he feels more freedom to be able to express that sorrow now that Rhaenys is dead. But really, he doesn't have an heir anymore, and so I wouldn't be surprised if Alan and Adam kind of felt like this is a little bit too little too late, at least in terms of the emotion. I'm sure they'd take the title regardless. But does he actually care about us and want to show us that affection that he was never showing us and is only showing us now because his other children, his original heirs, are dead? And very interestingly, Rhaenyra is reluctant to legitimize these children because of her own previous actions with Harwin Strong and all three of her own children being illegitimate by bloodline. And sure, Jacaerys is now dead, Lucerys is now dead, but Joffrey is not a Velaryon, he is not of Old Valyria, he is a Strong. And therefore, by legitimizing Corlys's illegitimate children, she actually draws the legitimacy of Joffrey's claim into direct question, which is very interesting. And yes, it is worth mentioning, of course, that Jacaerys dies in episode 1. Now, the books are a bit ambiguous as to how that exactly happens. It's alluded that it might be a crossbow bolt, it might be a grapple, but it's not known for sure. But in the show, they opt to have a grapnel hit Vermax and then drag him under the water. Now, this is quite a clever tactic, and I enjoy seeing it on screen, but at the end of the day, I don't think this would work because all that's attaching the grapple to the scale and then to the weight on the other end is a piece of rope, and rope you can burn. So yeah, I get that Vermax is maybe stressed and he can't reach the rope to bite it, but can't he just breathe fire on it? If you breathe fire on the rope, it would just burn and then he'd be fine. So I don't really know why he had to die in that way and couldn't just be hit with a crossbow bolt. But anyway, he was always going to die, so not a big problem for me. But it's examples like this where we're not adapting the source material in a way which I think would best serve the story and instead leaves more questions than answers. It feels like we're killing Jace because he has to die in this event rather than showing us how he died and why he wasn't able to get out of that situation. And Emma Darcy's acting in the second episode when she is talking to Jace's corpse is incredibly powerful. They are such a good actor. Genuinely unbelievable performance, and you really feel the pain in Rhaenyra. In my opinion, after Paddy Considine's Viserys, Emma Darcy's Rhaenyra is the emotional linchpin of the show. And the third season is very focused on Rhaenyra in particular, it seems like. We are not really following the Greens. If we are, we're following Alicent. But Rhaenyra is the main character, basically, of this show. Rhaenyra and her relationship with Daemon is very important. Aemond, after kissing his mum for some reason, I guess he likes older women, very strange of him, but quite in keeping as a Targaryen, he's gone to Harrenhal. And he goes there, and then he kills Simon Strong and his family, but then one of them lands a blow on him. They stab him, and then he falls to the floor. Now, I don't think anyone really believes that Aemond has died there, because Aemond is pleading with Alice Rivers for help. And it seems pretty obvious that Alice is going to extend that help, but Alice is someone who is self-serving, and so I'm very interested to see how Aemond will be indebted to her in some way, what kind of things she will want from Aemond in return for helping him, treating his wound, and nursing him back to health. And in the third episode, it's revealed that Lord Ormond of Hightower, who gave Daeron to Rhaenyra, actually gave a fake child to her to keep Daeron for himself, presumably. As for exactly what the reason would be that he would do this, not really sure. I guess we'll have to find out. I don't remember this being in Fire and Blood, but I might be wrong. So I'm curious to see where that goes as well. But the problem with Daeron links to something deeper. Now, we haven't actually seen Daeron up to this point point because apparently it would be too confusing to have him in the story, and the writers were focused on building our emotional connections with the existing characters, which I can understand and actually does work to the story's benefit when we don't even know if this is Daron or not. It doesn't even cross my mind to think that this wouldn't be him until right at the very end. But the problem with Daron overall is something that links to this show more broadly, which is that often, because the show does not know what it wants to do in the future, it does not adequately set up events such that they pay off as well as they should. For example, I do think we should have seen Daron by now, because I know the story. I know that Daron exists and was sent off to Old Town right when he was very young. Alicent's hardly ever seen him. I know that, and I have known that throughout the last 2 seasons. But if you have never read the thing, you don't even really know that that's the case. Daron, I think, has maybe been mentioned, perhaps, but it's not easy to remember. And I don't like the fact that the show often requires you to know things peripherally, or for you to do some homework to be able to understand what's going on in the story. I don't think that House of the Dragon does a very good job sometimes of laying out what the story is and hand-holding you through every single thing. I don't want a patronizing show, but with Game of Thrones, everything that was paid off in those earlier seasons was set up, and time was taken, deliberate time was spent setting up certain payoffs. I feel like in House of the Dragon, they don't even bother sometimes. The battles do just feel like they're here because that's where we are in the Fire and Blood story. For example, one of the Lannister twins, Tyland or one of them, I'm not sure exactly which one it was, but not the one that Abigail Thorne threw over the edge of a ship, which was pretty funny. But one of the Lannister twins, he gets killed by the Starks, that other twin. And all that happens is that the Stark guy chucks the head towards Daemon, and that's you seeing that he's killed. And if that was in Game of Thrones, that would not have been what had happened. In Game of Thrones, they would have showed you the Stark guy killing that Lannister. I get that the story is also about Starks and Lannisters, but I feel like we're missing a scene where we should have seen him get killed, but the show skips over it as if it's not important, as if that character didn't mean anything and therefore his death you wouldn't have been interested in. I actually would have been interested in his death. We spent a lot of time with those Lannister characters, especially in the 2nd season. I need to see him die. I need to see the battles unfold, or at least parts of them. You can't just skip to him being dead. It's like when they skipped to the end of the battle and they said the Beesbury's came to our aid. Show me that. Show me a scene of one of the Beesbury's pledging their allegiance to Rhaenyra instead of Aegon. And this is why House of the Dragon does not feel as lived in as Game of Thrones did. And that is a problem, and I don't think they're going to fix it, I'm afraid. So this show will forever exist with you needing to fully appreciate it and understanding of the source material, which is never how you are supposed to enjoy a show. It should not be necessary for you to do that. That should be optional. And one more thing, this show can sometimes look like vomit. This hasn't really annoyed me before because when the show has been dark, then you just go, okay, it's dark, right? You can't really see the stuff happening on the screen. I'll just turn up the brightness. It's not a big deal. But I didn't like the fact that the colors were so muted in House of the Dragon, certainly compared to earlier seasons of Game of Thrones. And in season 3, oh my god, the directing, videography, whatever you want to call it, it is shocking. Why are we placing everything in the middle of the frame? Have you ever heard of blocking? The composition of each shot is terrible. There are so few shots that are genuinely structured well in this show anymore. Everything is centrally framed, so you can just cut the sides off, add a saturation filter, put on some subtitles, and that Polish Sigma grindset music underneath.
Wonderful.
I hate the central framing, and the focus of the cameras is so shallow, which means the only thing in focus in a shot is the middle. You try looking at anything along the border of these shots. It's like you're looking at something you're not supposed to. Why can't I look at the entire frame? Why have I got to focus on the middle? Why are you restricting me from seeing anything other than the middle of the frame? Change the focus of your camera. I think I've made the point. Wow, turns out I was quite annoyed by that. Anyway, we'll be talking about episodes 4 to 8 in future videos, so check them out.